It's nice to be here on the opening of the Heritage Museum. I remember eons ago when I was in 5th grade at my grade school, and they had dedicated the land to the Heritage Museum and so forth, and they loaded up a bunch of us and brought us here, and we spent the day picking rocks. They were peeling logs at the time, but we were picking rocks. So it's kind of nice to see everything in place and see how far it's come and so forth over the years. It's also kind of interesting because for grad school I was unemployed. And so my wife Kim was the city clerk treasurer at the time, and so I was back here, and my buddy Jeff Gruber called me up and said, they've got a traveling archivist coming through who's going to train some of us on how to do archival work. Are you interested in coming down and helping us out? And it's like, yeah, I got nothing else to do, fine. So I actually started my archival career in the little archives here in the Heritage Museum, so it's nice to be back. It's nice to be back home. As Becky said, this is kind of an interesting story that I bumped into the first time when I was working on my master's thesis. I wrote my master's thesis on a 1917 timber strike that happened in Eureka, and while I was working on that strike, I kept running into references to these individuals who served in the forestry regiment, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So just kind of tucked it aside and waited for an opportunity to delve a little deeper into it. And so a few years ago, I checked out, seeing what we had in the collections at the Historical Society and what's available. And actually, it's a very rich history, and it's amazing how relevant it is to Libby in western Montana, in large part because of the University of Montana Forestry School, which was created in 1915, which incidentally enough, the first dean of that forestry school had been serving as the supervisor of the Kootenai National Forest, Doris Skills. So the Doris Skills campground on Bull Lake is named after him, and he was, I believe he was the first SO for the Kootenai National Forest. And then he became the first dean of the forestry school at U of M in 1950. Now, I asked my buddy Jeff Gruber if he had a photograph of the Libby Mill around 1915, and he assured me he did. He sent me 2 photographs. One of them wasn't labeled. The other one was labeled 1936. So I'm not sure if the 1915 photograph is actually 1915. So you let me know if he did right by me or if he got it wrong. Is that 1915 Libby Mill, Libby Lumber Company? It's got to be the same burner. I think that would probably be the way to maybe determine the age of it. I was hoping somebody in the audience would tell me, no, it's not 1915, it's 1930, and Jeff got it wrong, just so I could give him a bad time about it. So, the 19-teens were an interesting time in Lincoln County and in western Montana on a number of fronts. The Forest Service is really kicking into business. They'd been around since 1905. They're establishing themselves. They became a large part of the communities that they were integrated into, and really helped grow the area, if you will. 1910, you've got Jay Niels and the Shevlin family coming in and starting buying the Dawson Lumber Company and creating the Libby Lumber Company and expanding the mill in 1915 so that they could do greater production and so forth. By 1917, Montana and the rest of the United States had been watching the war develop in Europe and realizing that it was a really pretty horrific thing to occur. Whether or not the U.S. was going to get into it, I think by 1917 everybody figured it was just a matter of time before that would occur. How we would become involved with it and how men would participate in the war was something that folks were uncertain of. And so that's one of the things that's interesting about the forestry regiments that were created. I don't think anybody even had that on their radar at the time, that this was something that was going to be of such a major concern for the war effort. And the Library of Congress had these great images of them actually recruiting lumbermen and loggers from Canada, because Canada was a British possession and so forth. They were sending troops to Europe to fight in the war. So they were actually sending lots of Canadian lumbermen and portable mills and so forth to France to cut timber. This is World War I. They're using wood for everything. It's an essential wartime material that they needed to have. Now, what's unusual about this is that even though armies for years had what they called pioneers, who did a lot of the grunt work for the army to make sure that they were logistically supplied and so forth, they never had specific units dedicated to just cutting timber until World War I. And so that's really what makes this story unique. And so Canada was kind of the leading example of that, if you will. There was a trade magazine called The Timberman that was edited out of Oregon. It talked a lot about the lumbermen going over from Canada to cut timber in France and those types of things. And so they were very aware of the necessity. And some of the things that they were using the wood for were duck boards in the trenches. And the duck boards were basically on the floor of the trench to get the men up out of the mud and so forth, so they wouldn't get trench foot. So they would be less susceptible to some of the other diseases and so forth, pneumonia and those types of things. Firing step, so they could step up and get their head above the trench in order to shoot. What they called, and this isn't well, maybe it is a French iteration of the word, revetment. So to reinforce the walls of the trenches and so forth, they would either use planks or what they called fascines, which were bundles of twigs and small saplings and so forth that they would put up to hold the trench walls in place. All kinds of things, stakes for wire entanglements, railroad ties, because they were traveling things, railroads. Lumber was really a big thing. They were even using wood to cook their meals and so forth. So I mean, this is the modern military. So by 1917, the Canadians had over 10,000 lumbermen working in France just cutting timber for Great Britain and their allies against Germany. They had over 100 portable mills working behind the lines. And so this is one of the things that the timbermen reported on constantly. It was one of the reasons that foresters were so important in the war effort, was the fact that France is an old country. They had been harvesting timber for a very, very long time. There's a limited supply of timber available in France that they could use for the war effort. So the idea was not only to win the war, but also not strip the landscape bare of every stick of wood in Europe. And so you have this interesting mix of what's best for the war effort and what's best for the timber industry, for forestry in Europe as well. And so there's some loggerheads going on at this as we go forward. So President Wilson went before Congress in April 2nd, 1917, and asked for a declaration of war against Germany and her allies. The Senate and the House passed the resolution saying that yes, the United States would declare war against Germany and Austria and so forth. And 2 weeks, and so this is where it kind of overlaps and so forth. 2 weeks after that declaration of war and the United States begins to talk about implementing a draft and so forth, 80 river drivers for the Eureka Lumber Company go out on strike at the same time, or just about the same time. And so you see the list of demands that they had placed before the Eureka Lumber Company and what they were looking for: the 8-hour day, clean bunks, better food, basic things that you would think would be available, increase in pay and so forth, because the industry was all of a sudden making more money than it had in a long time. The interesting thing about this is that the first place federal troops were placed after the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917 was not overseas, it was in Eureka, Montana. So you have this strike that starts in Eureka, and by the time the strike is broken in September of 1917, it has spread from Eureka, Montana all the way to the Pacific Northwest. And at the same time that you have the strike going on, you've got the U.S. military for the very first time trying to recruit loggers and lumbermen to go to France to cut timber. So it's really kind of a mishmash of things going on and butting heads against one another as they're trying to find enough people to fill voids and so forth and to keep the timber industry alive and moving along and assisting in the war effort. It's really pretty fascinating. And again, timber was declared an essential wartime industry. It was used in a number of things, from shipbuilding to this modern contraption called the airplane, which was made typically out of spruce or white pine and was ran by what we would call a lawnmower motor now, and just wrapped in fabric. Just about anything that you could think of that was required for wood was necessary. The hope was, with the United States declaring war, that they could end the war by 1920. Nobody expected, none of the Allies expected Germany to crumble as quickly as it did. And it was going to take a while for U.S. production to get up to speed in order to provide the necessary equipment and so forth for the American military, because the American military at the time didn't have a lot of the fancy equipment and so forth that the Europeans had developed, like tanks and serviceable airplanes that could actually fly combat and that types of things. The same thing applied to them cutting timber. So when the first batch of soldiers went over to France with General Pershing, one of the first things General Pershing realized was that he was going to need a regiment dedicated solely to cutting timber. And two of the individuals that he took with him at the time were leaders in the Forest Service, Henry S. Graves and William B. Greeley. And so he tasked them with recruiting this forestry regiment, essentially. And so the recruitment went out. The recruitment call went out for men who were used to cutting timber of similar size and dimension as what they were going to be cutting in Europe. And so that primarily included what they called the short log country at the time, which was western Montana, the panhandle of Idaho, and eastern Washington, because the lumber was about the same dimension. So that put Region 1 right in the middle of the mix, based out of Missoula. It also put the University of Montana Forestry School right into the mix as well, as being logical places to where they could recruit. So these individuals wouldn't actually work directly on the front lines, but they were close enough that they could supply the front lines as they were going forward with the advance. So the first regiment that they created was called the 10th Engineers, and as I said, they recruited heavily out of Region 1. And so you saw a lot of individuals from the university and from the Forest Service enlisting in the war effort. As I mentioned, one of the individuals that did that was Doris Skeels, who was the dean of the forestry school at the time. He was commissioned as a captain in the 10th Engineers, and several of the students in the forestry school also enlisted as well as part of the 10th Engineers. They were sent to Camp America, just outside of D.C., where they were given basic military training. They were supposed to meet the same physical standards as a frontline soldier and so forth, but they weren't doing drill with firearms and those types of things. And as a matter of fact, as a lumberman in the 10th Engineers, if you were missing a few digits, that just meant that you knew what it was like to work on the job. So you didn't necessarily need a trigger finger. So that was a good thing. And then as soon as they were trained, they were shipped overseas on the SS Carpathia. Carpathia was also the ship that answered the distress call of the Titanic when it sunk. So they call themselves the Carpathians from thereafter, as they were the first batch of forestry individuals to get there. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for the local newspaper to publish letters from men serving in the military. And so in 1917, George Basie's letter to his sister here in Libby was published in the local newspaper. And then the timbermen as well reported on what was going on overseas. So Basie's letter is is kind of interesting as he describes what it's like in the training camp. So he said, we drill about 7 hours a day. Yesterday I stepped out with sore feet and they put me on the wood pile for 3 hours. Today I stepped out with tight shoes and they marched us through 2 creeks, got our shoes all soaked up and marched us until our shoes were dry. I guess that'll do us for a while. As soon as these individuals were trained, they were shipped overseas, and they were full of spunk. One of the individuals in the 10th Engineer told Greeley when they landed in France that they weren't much on marching, but they were hell on cutting wood, and they were ready to get it done. As soon as the 10th Engineers arrived in France, they realized that there weren't enough men to do the job. France really wanted the United States to provide wood from the U.S. And to provide its own portable mills and so forth. There just wasn't enough shipping to do that type of thing. So the decision was made that instead of doing that, they would cut French timber using French sawmills and so forth to process the lumber, which created an interesting scenario or two. As a matter of fact, the Americans for the 10th Engineers were so frustrated with French equipment that one of the head sawyers bet that he could chew through more wood in a day than a French sawmill could cut. It doesn't say on whether or not anybody took him up on the bet, but it was out there. And then this one quote I really like: French mills were aggravations of the flesh and promoters of profanity. Like it ever took much to make a logger cuss, right? Yeah. So, but it became clear that they really needed to have a second regiment as soon as possible, and a larger regiment. So the call went out for the creation of the 20th Engineers, and this is where they really started to draw on individuals from Lincoln County. So going through there was a book published in 1920 by the editor of the newspaper here in town called Lincoln County's Contributions During the Great War, and it lists all the individuals who were from Lincoln County that served in uniform. This is a list of individuals from the various parts of Lincoln County that served at the time. And so of the 351 or so men that are listed in that, 31 of them served in the Engineers. Either in the 10th or the 20th Engineers. And you can see it's Troy, Tobacco Valley, which included Eureka, Fort Time, Trigo, and then Libby, of course, individuals that served. And I imagine there's more than a few names up there that are familiar, even today. So you could see that they drew heavily on individuals from Lincoln County and so forth. And again, sent to Camp American University in DC for training and then shipped overseas to use the portable mills and so forth over there. It wasn't always easy for them because they were used to cutting, the individuals from here were used to cutting softwood, and a lot of the timber in Europe was hardwood. And so one of the more funny instances that occurred was that they were cutting timber on the opposite side of a lake, so they figured that they would just raft the logs across the lake to the mill, just like they did at home, right? So they dumped the logs, they limbed them all up, made a raft, started to drag it across the lake, and the entire raft of logs sunk. And they realized that, oh, maybe hardwood is a tad bit heavier than softwood. So the next batch that they cut, they left all the limbs on so they had more surface to float on, and kind of like outriggers so that the lower logs wouldn't sink. So they learned as they went going along through that process. The second large transport of Americans to France for World War I included individuals of the 20th Engineers was the SS Tuscania, which was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland in February of 1917. And this was the first real instance of mass casualties for the U.S. to experience during the war, and it was quite a shock to occur at the time. There were 2,179 American soldiers aboard when it was torpedoed, and the local newspaper out of Missoula reported heavily on this just because of the number of Montana men that had joined the 20th Engineers and the number of individuals who had attended the forestry school. So they were very aware that this was going to impact the community, and they wanted to be able to stay up to speed on the reporting of what was going on in terms of the casualties and so forth. And essentially they were the first ones to deliver the news to Montana that there had been the sinking of the Tuscania that could severely impact Montana families. One of those individuals was George Upham from Troy, and George Upham was actually one of the luckier ones that made it into a lifeboat with 35 other men. Unfortunately, the lifeboat capsized before it reached shore, and only 5 of them actually made it to shore. George was one of the 5, but in the process of making it to the shore, he was washed up against the rocks so many times that, as you can see from the note, he carried the scars for the rest of his life. And it took him a while to recover from the event. Another individual from Troy that was on the Tuscania, well, he was on the Tuscania prior to it being torpedoed, was Romeo Garrison out of Troy. Romeo was actually lucky because he had measles. And so they decided that since his case of measles were so bad, they were going to take him off the ship and send him ashore ahead of everybody else so that they could treat him. So he was actually on shore in a hospital when the Tuscania and the rest of his company on board was sunk. And so when everything was said and done, Romeo Garrison was the only survivor of that company. He did later recover from his bout of measles and was reassigned to the 20th Engineers to a different company and served through the length of the war. So the bodies that washed up on shore were buried here in the photograph that you can see on the island of Islay, which I think is Scottish. And amongst those individuals who were killed, 7 were Montanans. None of them, fortunately for us, from Lincoln County, but there were 7 individuals from Montana who lost their lives in that. And as you can imagine, there was a fair amount of anger about the fact that the ship was torpedoed and sunk. Of course, that was one of the things that drew the United States into World War I, was the unrestricted submarine warfare against shipping, sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, and the loss of civilian lives and so forth. So the idea was to put an end to this as quickly as possible. In the process of rescuing individuals from the sinking Tuscania, not everybody had a lifeboat. So British destroyers would actually get in as close as possible to the Tuscania as they could as it sunk and heave men aboard ship, which was in itself quite dangerous, and more than one got injured in that process, but they managed to get several off. The total loss, when you consider that there was over 2,000 men aboard, was 210. So fairly minimal, but still tragic for sure. 91 of those were actually members of the 20th Engineers. So that was a pretty good hit for a non-combatant unit in a time of war. After the 20th Engineers got to France, the decision was made that it didn't make sense to have 2 regiments when they could just combine the 2 together. So they quickly combined the 2 together under the banner of the 20th Engineers, and they set up shop. So it, at that time, became the largest regiment in the world. It had 360 officers and 18,183 enlisted men. It was huge. The interesting thing about it is members of the US Army Corps of Engineers served as the headquarters officers for it. And then as you drill down into who's actually doing the work and so forth, there might be an officer overseeing a company, but things quickly evolved to the point to where the person in charge was the person who typically was in charge with operating the mill or the logging operations back home. It didn't matter about rank. And the officers at the time in the Corps of Engineers were wise enough to actually step back and let that occur so that they had more efficiency in cutting the timber. The officers were left, however, fighting with the French foresters about what they could cut. An interesting but long piece from Charles Wingett, who was one of the forestry students at U of M. Photographs are from the 20th Engineers actually has a great history page. They still exist to this day. You go to their web page, you click on their history page, and it's absolutely phenomenal. The next batch of photographs that I have here are actually photographs that are from the publication that the Forest History Society did of logging operations of American troops over in France during the war. But Wingett's description of what French forestry was like is pretty entertaining. He writes, "It's a peculiar sight to see the French people log. Many are the days I have sat in Professor Drake's class and listened to his profound expostulations of French and German logging methods where forestry was born. All the time I was thinking to myself, now look here, Professor, there ain't no country where you gotta save all the small twigs for firewood and let the trees down soft like so the undergrowth won't get injured. You can't spring that old stuff on me, expect us to write it down for future reference. Nevertheless, it's all true. In order for an American lumberjack to become a French logger, it will be necessary for him to drink squirrel whiskey so he can shinny up to the top of the trees. And first thing, cut all the branches off the tree so when the tree is fallen, it doesn't destroy the understory, the undergrowth, and protects it. The tree then is cut as close to the ground as possible so that you don't have any of those nifty high stumps that we have still around here that we can see. And then using a little business something in order of a square to sight, they can fall a tree within a gnat's, well, within a few inches of where they want it. Seriously, however, they have this forestry down to a fine point and waste nothing which is suitable for lumber. They have to be, for France is not heavily timbered country like the western states where we live. Lucky will be the days when the states get down to such a basis. Not until one has been in this country and seen with his own eyes the care with which this lumber industry is carried on, can he realize the useless and extravagant waste in our American lumber industries and operations." So it's quite the deal. I doubt that would go over too well nowadays. I doubt it went over too well back then. But it was interesting that the forestry student would pick up on that as they went along. So by spring of 1918, there are 9,000 Americans working timber in France. I mean, the effort is huge. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Graves wrote about what was going on, stating that if the war keeps on long enough, the forests of France will be depleted. And that was one of the things that home trade journals like the Timberman talked about quite a bit, was how to preserve forests in Europe while the war was being done and how to recoup those lost timberlands and so forth after the war as well. He writes, "We use even the tops of the trees. The twigs are gathered into bundles about 6 or 8 feet long and 8 or 10 inches thick and bound tightly with wire. They're called fascines. They are a staple in military road work because they can fill any bad hole or mud hole so that immediately you can begin to travel across them." They also created a number of what they called flying squads, and these were small groups of loggers who worked extremely close to the front lines to provide needed wood materials and so forth to the frontline soldiers. These guys were actually close enough to where some of them may indeed have seen some action during the war. As a matter of fact, the Timberman reported kind of tongue-in-cheek that there was one instance of a PV-wielding logger capturing a downed German pilot. And the downed German pilot was so sure that the PV was some exotic weapon of mass destruction that even though that's all he saw the logger carrying, he immediately surrendered his pistol and put his hands up. So, as my history professor at U of M used to say, if it didn't happen that way, it should have. Really should have. Really, really should have. So it's an interesting it's an interesting scenario, and again, the Americans were really interested in hitting their production quotas and so forth for the war effort, and so they were pushing themselves and the mills to insane production quotas and so forth. And then this is just a quick graphic of the number of logging mills that the Americans had set up in France during the war. And I had a number somewhere, but I don't see it right now. One of the individuals, continue with Greeley's assessment of cutting timber in France. He said it was a negotiation with the French. It wasn't a fact of just being able to go and cut everything that you needed regardless. You actually had to negotiate with the French foresters what you could cut. You could not cut what you willed. You could only cut what was designated by them to cut. And so this, as I said, created a vast amount of discord amongst the French, or between the French and their American counterparts, because in every logging camp of Americans, there was a French liaison officer who served. And so Captain George Slack from Kalispell, Montana, was one of those individuals who ran afoul of a French counterpart, to the point that he became so frustrated, and I'm sure he probably used a few profane words, but he informed the Frenchmen that they had a choice. They could either win the war for him, or he could save the forest. He couldn't do both. So they figured it out. It wasn't always easy, but they did manage to figure it out and meet their production, as this banner shows here of them in a 10-hour day cutting 64,000 feet of timber in a 5M capacity mill, which is pretty impressive. And these guys weren't equipped fully because they were borrowing from the French and so forth. They didn't have their own stuff coming from the U.S. They had to improvise. So in some instances, they didn't have horses to actually haul the logs in from the woods to the mill. So the men drug them themselves. They didn't have harness equipment for horses and so forth. So they fashioned harness equipment out of whatever canvas that they could locate in order to drag the timber to the mills and so forth to keep them up and running. And as I mentioned, nobody quite expected the German army to collapse as quickly as it did. I mean, the expectation was that the war would last till 1920. By November of 1918, it was pretty clear that Germany was done. And so the war wasn't going to last as long as they had feared. And of course, when a war ends, everybody wants to go home, right? Why the heck would you want to stay when the job's over with? You just want to go home, you want to be with your family, you want life to return to some sense of normalcy and so forth. Well, they couldn't do that. And they really couldn't do that with the engineer battalions, because those individuals were necessary to help kind of rebuild the infrastructure of France, and to some extent Germany as well, to get them back on their feet to where they could take care of themselves. So most of the members of the 10th and 20th Engineers, now the 20th Engineers, actually ended up staying in France until late 1919 before they were released and sent home, which again caused a severe amount of frustration to Captain Slack, who wrote nasty letters to the commanding officers that he was an old man, he was 45 at the time, he just needed to go home. And we know this because we actually have Captain Slack's papers at the Historical Society. So it's actually kind of cool reading some of his letters and his arguments for why he should get to go home. The fact that he's got rheumatism and he's 45 and he's just too old for this kind of game. And he's supposed to be there cutting timber, not building roads. And so there's a mad dash to try to get home. But it was an incredible effort on the part of the United States military. It was, as Becky mentioned in the introduction, it was the very first time that the United States military had ever created a regiment solely for the purpose of cutting timber and outfitted them as such. And the fact that they created it and it became a permanent part of the military structure is also pretty amazing. And then you have these individuals coming home. And, you know, we don't have a lot in the historical record from individuals from this area who served in the 10th and 20th Engineers. The Historical Society did a big oral history project back in the 1980s, and they managed to actually talk to a number of men who'd served in the 20th Engineers during the war and so forth. But it was an oral history interview, and not, in most cases, that wasn't followed to a conclusion of, well, what exactly was the 20th Engineers? So what we have in terms of their stories are few and far between. So if you have a World War I veteran in your family, and they were from this area and so forth, see what you have left of the old family records and so forth, and if there's anything from that individual, because those are precious. This is a story that needs more filling out so folks can understand the true contribution that these individuals made to the war effort, and American forestry made to the war effort. The concept of forestry was relatively new to the United States. As I said, the forestry school in Missoula was created in 1915. Of all the forestry schools in the United States, and I believe Yale had one, and one of the other Ivy League schools did, they were much older than U of M. U of M's forestry school contributed more members to the 10th and 20th Engineers than any other forestry school in the United States. So it's pretty impressive when you put that up. And they got a cool flag. I mean, it's a cool flag. Lumberjacks, right? Libby loggers. These next couple of slides I just wanted to show to you, just so you have an idea of some of the records that are available at your Montana Historical Society that are actually available online. If any of you heard of the Montana Memory Project? Okay. So the Historical Society has a number of collections up on that from our files. These are actually service cards from members of Lincoln County who served in the 20th Engineers from the Adjutant General's office. And it lists the dates that they were enlisted, the companies that they served in, and the date of the termination of their enlistment and so forth. And like I said, you can find all of these on scanned online. I couldn't find everybody that served in the 10th and 20th, but I found enough to make it kind of interesting. And then, as I said, the 20th Engineers established itself as a permanent part of the U.S. military, as you can see by the campaign ribbons that they have garnered over the years, from the very first one at the top for their service in World War I to Afghanistan. They are still around. They are still doing their job. Their motto is build and fight. They've got crossed axes. Again, how cool of a logo is that? I mean, coming from Libby, we all like an axe, right? Especially a sharp one. So it's an interesting time period. It's an interesting story. And I think we need to talk a bit more about the contributions that the timber industry has made to our country. And the fact that this is a very local story with a very large international stamp on it, because these guys didn't just serve in the U.S. military, they served overseas in France. As a matter of fact, some of the individuals that served in the timber industry during World War I actually served in what they called spruce squadrons in Washington and Oregon, cutting spruce timber in those two states for the war effort. So loggers have played an important role in modern military history for the United States, and that's part of our story and part of our legacy as well. I have not heard from Mr. Akins about the research that he's done on his ancestor who served at the time. It would be interesting. I know that there is a website that's dedicated to the 20th Engineers. You can find the link to it off the Forest History Society page, or you can find a link to it off of the 20th Engineers history page as well. And I know a number of individuals have posted stories about family members and so forth that have served in the 10th and 20th Engineers during the war. So maybe that's where Mr. Akins has placed some of the information, or got some of the information. It is really kind of fascinating that it has such a web presence, but it's so little known amongst the general population that these individuals actually served. Thank you, and enjoy.